Della Sutton came up the Cottonwood Creek road on the last cold morning of March, in a hired wagon with iron-rimmed wheels that found every frozen rut, and she had a marriage waiting for her at the end of it that she had agreed to entirely by letter. She was 34 years old. She had buried a husband 2 years before in a town 300 miles east, a good man who left her nothing but a debt and a reputation for being able to keep a house running on very little, and it was that reputation, passed mouth to mouth along the routes that women's reputations travel, that had brought the letter to her door. A man named Elias Ward needed a wife. He had 6 sons and a ranch on Cottonwood Creek and a house that no woman had managed since his first wife died. And he had written 4 sentences, plain as fence posts, that said as much. Della had read those 4 sentences at her own kitchen table and understood that the man who wrote them was not asking for love. He was asking for someone to take a job that no one in his own county would take. She had written back yes. She was not a woman who confused what she wanted with what was offered, and what was offered was a roof and work and the chance to be necessary somewhere, which after 2 years of being necessary nowhere had come to seem like a great deal. The wagon driver let her down at the gate and would not come past it. He said the Ward place had a feel to it he didn't care for, and he said it the way men say things they have heard others say without troubling to test them. And then he turned the team and left her standing in the road with her trunk and the cold coming up through her boots. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The house was bigger than she had pictured. 2 stories of squared logs gone silver with weather, a stone chimney at each end, a porch that ran the width of the front with a sag in the middle board where years of boots had worn it soft. Behind it stood a good barn and a row of outbuildings, and beyond those the land opened out, brown and waiting, running down to where the creek showed itself as a line of bare cottonwoods, and rising on the far side to a low bench where she could make out cattle standing in the thin light. It was not a poor place. That surprised her. From the way the wagon driver had spoken, she had expected something half-fallen, and instead she found a working ranch that simply looked, in some way she could not name yet, like a house that had stopped having anyone inside it who cared whether it lived. She carried her own trunk to the porch because there was no one to carry it for her. She knocked. She waited. She knocked again, and a boy opened the door. He was perhaps 10, with his father's coloring, which she would learn later, and a face that had decided before she arrived not to give her anything. Behind him in the dim front room, she could see others, a stair-step of them, watching from the places where boys watch from, the edge of a doorway, the bottom step, the dark behind a chair. She counted them without meaning to. 5, and then a 6th came down the stairs slow, the oldest, near a man already in the shoulders, and stood at the back with his arms crossed. "You'll be Mrs. Sutton," the oldest said, "not Mrs. Ward." She noted that and let it pass. "I'll be Della," she said, "and you'll be hungry, I expect, because it's near noon and I don't smell anything cooking." That was the first thing she said to the 6 sons of Elias Ward, and it was the right thing, though she had not planned it. She had simply looked at the cold stove behind them through the open door and said what was true, and something in the oldest boy's crossed arms shifted, not much, but enough, the way a gate shifts when a hand is laid on it before it is opened. Their father came in from the barn an hour later. By then Della had her coat off and the stove going and a pot of beans she'd found in the larder set to soften, and she had learned the boys' names the way you learn anything you intend to keep, by using them. Caleb, the oldest, 16 and silent. Then Asa, 14, who washed her hands when she worked. Then Tom, 12, and the 10-year-old who'd opened the door, whose name was Levi. Then Sam, 8, who could not stop himself from talking once he started. And the youngest, Wesley, 5, who had been a baby when his mother died, and so had never known a woman in the house at all, and who stood the whole time at the foot of the stairs with 2 fingers in his mouth, staring at her like she was whether he had heard about, but never seen. Elias Ward filled the doorway and brought the cold in with him. He was a big man, dark, with 3 days of beard and eyes that had gone somewhere a long way off and had not entirely come back. He looked at her standing at his wife's stove, and something crossed his face that she could not read, and that she suspected he could not have named himself. He took off his hat. "You came," he said. "I wrote that I would. People write that they will." "I'm not people," Della said. "I'm your wife. As of the magistrate in town signs the paper Thursday, and I'd thank you to wash before you sit at the table I've laid." He looked at her a moment longer. Then he went to the basin in the corner and washed, and he sat, and the 8 of them ate beans and the bread she had managed in the time she'd had, and no one spoke a word the entire meal except Sam, who asked her once if she had come on the train, and was hushed by Caleb before she could answer. That was the first supper. It was not the supper that united the house. That one came later, and when it came it changed everything, but Della did not know that yet. She knew only that she had walked into a place where grief had been allowed to set like concrete, taking the shape of whatever it filled, and that her work was going to be harder than washing and cooking. Her work was going to be teaching 7 people who had forgotten how to be a family that they still were one. She learned the shape of the trouble slowly, the way you learn the shape of a room in the dark. Elias Ward was not a cruel man. She decided that within the first week. He was a man who had been struck so hard that he had gone numb, and numbness in a man who has 6 sons and a ranch to run looks, from the outside, like coldness, and the town had read it as coldness and stopped looking closer. His wife had been named Ruth. The boys spoke of her almost never, and when they did it was in the careful, flat voices of children who have learned that the subject brings the weather down, and Della gathered the facts of Ruth Ward the way you gather scattered things, one at a time, bending for each. Ruth had died 3 years ago, not in childbirth, as Della had first supposed, but of a fever that came through the valley one autumn and took 4 people in the county and left the rest, and it had taken her in 11 days while Elias rode for a doctor who arrived too late to do anything but confirm what the family already knew. She had been the kind of woman Della understood from the few things the boys let slip and the many things the house itself told her, who held a place together by main force of attention. There was a sewing room off the kitchen that no one had entered in 3 years, its door kept shut, and Della understood without being told that it had been Ruth's, and that shutting it had been the family's way of agreeing not to look at the size of the hole. The other trouble was money, and that she learned from Elias himself, on the 9th day, because it had reached the point where it could no longer be kept from a wife. He told her at the table after the boys were up the stairs to bed. He told it plainly, without softening it, which she came to understand was the only way he knew to tell anything. The winter Ruth died, and the winter after had gone hard against him. He had lost cattle to cold and to a sickness that swept the herd, and grief had made him slow to act when action might have saved some of them. And he had needed money to carry the ranch and the boys through, and he had borrowed it. He had borrowed it from a man named Vernon Dunmore, who kept an office in the county seat at Ledford, and who lent money to ranchers in trouble at terms that looked like mercy when you signed them and looked like a noose when they came due. How much? Della asked. He told her. It was a great deal. More than the ranch could raise in a year, near as she could reckon it, and the note came due at the end of June. And when it came due and could not be paid, Dunmore had the right to take land in settlement. All of it, she asked. The home quarter, Elias said. The 160 acres the house sits on. The spring. The hay ground along the creek. He turned his cup in his hands. That's what he wants. He said as much, plain. The grazing land out on the bench is worth less, and he knows it. The home quarter is the heart of the place. A man can't run cattle without water and hay, and the only water that runs year-round on this whole stretch comes up out of that spring. Dunmore takes the home quarter. He doesn't just take a house. He takes the whole operation, because the rest of it's worthless without it. He's not lending me money. He's been buying the home quarter slow, and calling it a loan, and waiting. Della sat with that. Outside, an owl said something twice, and was quiet. Does he know about your sons? She asked. Elias looked at her, not understanding. That you have 6 of them, she said. That this is their home. That you marrying me, taking on a stranger to keep the house, is a man trying everything he can think of to hold the thing together for them. Does Dunmore know that? Or does he think he's foreclosing on a parcel of dirt? He knows, Elias said. It makes no difference to him. No, Della agreed. It wouldn't. To a man like that it would make less than none. 6 sons just means more people to feel sorry for when the day comes, and feeling sorry for people is free. She rose and took his cup. We'll think on it, she said. There's always more in a thing than what's lying on top of it. I found that to be true. She had no plan when she said it. She said it because she had learned, in 2 years of being a widow with a debt, that the worst thing you can do to a person who is drowning is agree with them about the water. But the words sat with her after. the way true words do, and she found herself in the following days looking at the Ward place not as a house to be kept, but as a problem to be read, and she had always been good at reading. The supper that changed the house came on a Sunday near the end of April. She had been 3 weeks at the ranch by then, married for 2 of them, and she had won small ground in that time. The way you win at anything worth winning, by paying attention to what people couldn't say. She had learned that Sam talked because no one had listened to him in 3 years, and the words had backed up in him like water behind a beaver dam. She had learned that Wesley, the littlest, would let her braid bread dough beside him at the table if she did not look directly at him while she did it, the way you gentle a wild thing by pretending you don't see it. She had learned that Caleb, the oldest, had been carrying the place on his 16-year-old back, doing a man's work since he was 13, and that the hardness in him was not meanness but exhaustion wearing a younger face then. It should. What she had not done was reach Elias, or get the boys to sit at a table like a family instead of like prisoners who happened to eat in the same room. And she had not opened the sewing room, though she thought of it more and more, the way you think of a sound in the night you have decided not to investigate. That Sunday she decided to cook a real supper. Not beans and bread thrown together against the clock, but the kind of meal her own mother had made. The kind that takes a whole day and announces by its smell hours ahead that something is coming. She had killed and dressed 2 hens. She had a roast going from a quarter of beef Caleb had brought in. She made dumplings and a dried apple pie from the last of the winter apples in the cellar and bread that she'd started before dawn, and by 4 in the afternoon the house smelled the way a house is supposed to smell, and she watched the smell do its work. The little ones came first, drawn down the stairs by it. Wesley and Sam, hovering at the kitchen edge. Then Levi and Tom, pretending they had business near the stove. Then Asa, who washed her hands as he always did and finally asked, quiet, if he could help. And she put him to mashing potatoes, and he did it with a seriousness that nearly undid her. Caleb came in from the barn at the end of the day and stopped in the doorway and stood there a long moment. And Della understood, watching his face, that the boy was remembering. That the smell had reached back 3 years and found something and pulled it up into the light, and that for the first time since she'd arrived, he was looking at the kitchen not as a place his mother had died out of, but as a place where, once, this had happened, this exact thing, the smell and the warmth and the noise of a family on a Sunday. She laid the table for 8. She put a cloth on it, one she'd found folded in the linen chest, white with a worked border, and she did not know it was Ruth's until she saw Caleb see it. And she nearly took it off again. But something told her to leave it. Some instinct that the boy needed to see that his mother's things could be used and not only mourned, that the cloth could hold a meal again and not just dust. Elias came in last. He stopped the way Caleb had stopped, in the doorway, and he looked at the table and the cloth and the 7 of them already gathering, and Della watched 3 years of numbness crack down the middle of the man's face like ice on a pond when the thaw comes up underneath it. He sat at the head of the table. He looked at the food. And then Elias Ward, who Della had not heard string more than 4 sentences together in 3 weeks, bowed his head and said grace in a voice that shook, and thanked God for the food and for the hands that made it. And when he raised his head his eyes were wet, and he did not bother to hide it. And that was the moment the house turned. It turned at supper. Sam started talking, and no one hushed him. Tom told a story about a horse that everyone had heard before and laughed at anyway. Wesley fell asleep face down in his pie, and Asa carried him up the stairs. Caleb stayed at the table after the others rose, and helped Della clear, and at the sink, with his back to her, scrubbing a pot harder than it needed scrubbing, he said, she used to make a supper like that on Sundays, and Della said, I know. I could tell, and that was all either of them said, and it was enough. When the boys were all abed and the kitchen set right, Elias did not go to the barn or to his silence. He sat at the table where the cloth still lay, and he looked at Della, and he said, I don't know how to thank you for that. You don't thank a person for it, Della said. It's not a favor. It's a supper. You just have it again next Sunday, and the one after that, until it stops being a thing that surprises everyone and starts being just how the house is. This house hasn't been how a house is in 3 years. I know, she said. I'm aware. I've been living in the after of it. She sat down across from him. Elias, I'm going to ask you something, and you're going to think it's strange. The room off the kitchen. Ruth's room. The sewing room you've all kept shut. I want to open it. Not to throw anything out. To clean it and air it and use it. A shut room in a house is a wound that's been told not to heal. And I'd not do it without your leave, because it's hers, and yours, and the boys, and not mine to decide. But I think it wants opening." Elias was quiet a long time. Then he reached into his shirt and drew out, on a string around his neck, a key. He had been wearing it the whole 3 weeks, and she had never seen it. He lifted the string over his head and set the key on the cloth between them. "I haven't been in there since the day we shut it," he said. "I couldn't. The boys couldn't. We just shut the door and agreed not to talk about it being shut." He pushed the key an inch toward her. "If you can open it, open it. I think you might be the only one of us who can." She did not open it that night. It seemed to her a thing that should be done in daylight, with the windows that she would throw open showing real morning light. And so she waited until Monday, after the boys had gone to their work and Elias had ridden out to the bench to check the herd, and she stood alone in the kitchen with Ruth Ward's key in her hand and her heart going harder than the task warranted. The lock was stiff with 3 years of disuse and gave with a sound like a held breath let go. The room was small. A window faced east, and the morning came through it gray and dusty, lighting a space that had been left exactly as its occupant left it on the last ordinary day of her life, before the fever, when she had not known she was leaving it. A sewing machine stood under the window, a Treadle model, with a half-finished shirt still clamped under the needle, a small shirt, Wesley's size as he would have been 3 years ago, never finished. A work basket beside the chair with thread and a thimble and a pair of scissors laid down mid-task. A trunk against the far wall, a shelf of folded fabric, a rocking chair, and the smell, faint now but there, of a woman, lavender and machine oil, and something underneath that was just the smell of a person, the thing that fades last, and that Della knew would be gone within a day of the window being opened. And she stood a moment and let the boy's mother have her last morning of being smelled in her own room before she crossed and threw the window wide and let the spring in. She cleaned it slowly and with respect, the way you tend a grave. She did not throw anything out. She folded the fabric fresh and dusted the machine and oiled it and finished, after a long hesitation, the small shirt under the needle, because it seemed wrong to leave a thing 3 years half done when finishing it would take 10 minutes. And Wesley had a cousin somewhere it might fit, or it would fit some child, and a finished shirt is a kindness, and an unfinished one is only a wound. And it was while she was at the trunk, the last thing, that she found the document, though she did not know at first that it was anything at all. The trunk held Ruth's keepsakes, the small archive a woman keeps of her own life. Letters tied in ribbon. A christening gown, 6 times used and washed soft. A Bible. Pressed flowers gone to brown paper. And at the bottom, beneath a folded quilt top that Ruth had pieced and never quilted, a flat tin box, the kind that has a lid that fits down snug, the kind people keep papers in to guard them from damp and mice. And Della lifted it out and worked the lid loose and looked inside at a folded stack of documents and understood that she had found something Ruth Ward had thought worth protecting above almost everything else she owned. She did not understand what it was at first because the language of it was not language she used. There were several papers. There was a marriage record, hers and Elias's, dated 19 years back. There were the boys' birth records, all 6, in a mother's careful hand. And there was a single document, larger than the rest, printed and filled and stamped, and Della carried it to the window where the light was good and read it slowly, twice. And then she sat down in Ruth Ward's rocking chair because her legs had stopped being entirely reliable. It was a homestead patent. She knew that much from the heading, which said so in printed letters across the top, and from the eagle, and from the language beneath that ran in the formal phrases of the government granting land. She did not understand all of it, but she understood enough of it, reading slowly, to understand the thing that mattered, which was the name. The patent granted the land, 160 acres, described in the section and township numbers she could not parse, but recognized as a legal description of a specific piece of ground, to a single person, free and clear, in fee simple, for having entered the claim and lived upon it, and improved it, and proved it up under the homestead law of the United States. The name on the patent was not Elias Ward. The name on the patent was Ruth and Ward. And the land described, Della would confirm, but already in her bones knew, was the home quarter. The 160 acres the house sat on. The spring. The hay ground along the creek. The heart of the place. the exact ground that Vernon Dunmore intended to take in June for Elias Ward's debt. She sat in the rocking chair for a long time with the patent in her hands and the spring coming through the window, and she thought about Ruth and Ward, a woman she had never met, who had filed a homestead claim in her own name on the ground her family lived on, and had proved it up with her own labor over the years it took, and had received this patent from the government granting it to her, and had then folded it into a tin box and put it at the bottom of her trunk beneath a quilt she meant to finish someday, where it had sat for 3 years while her husband, who did not know it was there, or had forgotten if he ever knew, borrowed money against land he believed was his and was not. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Because that was the thing. Della read the dates, and the dates told a story. The patent was issued to Ruth 11 years back, well before the bad winters, well before the debt, well before Dunmore. The home quarter had been Ruth's, hers alone, in fee simple, for 11 years. Elias Ward had married a woman who already owned, in her own name and her own right, the most valuable 160 acres on Cottonwood Creek. And when Elias borrowed money and pledged the ranch against it, he had pledged what he owned, the grazing land, the buildings he'd built, the cattle. But the home quarter had never been his to pledge. You cannot mortgage land you do not own. The deepest, surest piece of the Ward place, the piece Dunmore was circling, had not belonged to Elias Ward on the day he signed Dunmore's note, and so it could not be taken to settle Elias Ward's debt. And Vernon Dunmore, sitting in his office in Ledford waiting for June, was waiting to foreclose on land that was not, and never had been, his debtors to lose. It had passed, on Ruth's death, not to her creditors, because she had none, and not entirely to her husband, but to her heirs, which under the law of the territory meant her children, the 6 boys, with Elias holding it for them. Della was not certain of all the mechanics, but she was certain of the shape of it. The home quarter belonged to the sons of Ruth and Ward, free and clear, and Vernon Dunmore could no more take it than he could take the sky. She did not run to tell Elias. She sat with it first, the whole afternoon, because a thing this large needed sitting with before it was said aloud, and because she wanted to be sure she had read it right before she put hope into a man who had been 3 years without it. She copied the section and township numbers onto a piece of paper. She noted the date and the place of recording, because the patent bore a county recorder's stamp on the reverse showing it had been recorded with the county, which meant the record of it existed not only in this tin box, but in the public books at the courthouse, where no fire in this room and no loss of this paper could erase it. Ruth had recorded it. Ruth had been thorough. Ruth had done, 11 years ago, the one thing that meant her children could not be put off their own land by a man like Dunmore, and then she had said nothing about it, the way women of her kind so often said nothing, doing the careful work and folding it away and trusting that someday someone would open the trunk. Della was the someone. She understood that, sitting in the rocking chair. The warm supper had not only thawed the house. It had earned her the key, and the key had opened the room, and the room had held the thing that saved them, and none of it would have happened if she had stayed a stranger who cooked beans against the clock. The house had let her in, and in letting her in it had let her find what it had been guarding. She told Elias that night, after the boys were abed, at the table where the cloth still lay. She did not tell it dramatically. She had decided that the size of the thing was better served by plainness. She set the tin box on the table and took out the patent and laid it in front of him and said, "I found this in Ruth's trunk. I want you to read it slow, and then I want to tell you what I think it means, and tomorrow I want to take it to a lawyer who can tell us if I'm right." Elias read it. She watched him read it. She watched him reach the name, and stop, and read the name again, and look up at her with an expression that was not yet hope, because hope is a thing a man in his situation does not let himself feel without permission. "This is Ruth's name," he said. "It is. On the home quarter. On the home quarter. A homestead patent. In her name, free and clear, dated 11 years back. Recorded with the county." Della leaned forward. "Elias, did you know? Did you know she'd done this?" He set the paper down with a hand that was not quite steady. "I knew she filed a claim," he said slowly, like a man pulling something up out of deep water. "Early on, before the boys, near. I had the bench land already, the grazing, that was mine from my own father. And the home quarter, the piece with the spring, that was open still, and she said, "Let me file on it." A married woman couldn't always, but there were ways. She said she'd file as, I don't recall the term, head of a household, or under some provision. And I let her, because it was more land for us and it cost nothing but the proving up, and she did the proving up herself, she and the boys when they came. She kept the improvements going, the garden and the fences and the house counted toward it. He stopped. I never thought of it again. We were married. It was all just the ranch. I never thought of whose name sat on which piece. When the bad years came and I went to Dunmore, I signed against the ranch. I never thought, I swear to you I never thought, that the best of it wasn't mine to sign. It wasn't, Della said gently. And that's the whole of it. You can't pledge what you don't own. Dunmore's note can take the bench land and the buildings, maybe, if it comes to it. It can't touch the home quarter. The home quarter was Ruth's, and it's the boys' now. And there's not a court in the territory will let a man foreclose on a debtor's land to satisfy a debt the land never owed. She put her hand flat on the table beside the paper. I think Ruth saved this place 11 years ago and never told you, because she was a woman who did the careful thing and folded it away and trusted it would matter someday. And it does. Today it does. Elias Ward put his face in his hands, and his shoulders shook, and Della let him, and did not touch him, because some weeping is private even when it happens in front of you. And a man who has carried 3 years of grief and 2 years of debt, and has just been told by a dead wife reaching forward through a tin box that the thing he feared most cannot happen, that man is owed the dignity of being let alone inside it. When he could speak, he said, I'd given it up. In my mind, I'd given the place up. I was marrying you to keep the boys fed through the foreclosure. I thought, to have someone steady when it all came down. I never told you that. That's near the whole of why I wrote that letter. I thought, get them a woman who can run a house on nothing, because nothing's what we're going to have. I know, Della said. I knew it from your 4 sentences. A man doesn't write a letter that bare unless he's writing from the bottom of something. She almost smiled. Well, we're not at the bottom anymore. But we're not safe yet either. A paper in a tin box is one thing. A paper a lawyer's blessed and a court's recognized is another. Tomorrow I'll take it to Ledford and we'll make it real in the eyes of the law, so that when Dunmore comes in June, it's not your word against his. It's the United States government's word, 11 years old and stamped, against his. She rode to Ledford on the Tuesday, in the wagon, with the tin box wrapped in oilcloth on the seat beside her and the patent inside her coat against her body wear. Nothing could happen to it. Caleb wanted to come, and she let him, because the boy had carried enough of the family's weight that he had earned the right to be present when some of it was lifted, and he sat beside her the 11 miles into the county seat and said little, but she could feel him reading the box on the seat the way Asa read her hands. The lawyer's name was Amos Greer, and he kept an office over the dry goods store with a window that looked down on the main street. And he was an older man, careful, with a way of listening that Della trusted before he'd said 10 words, because he listened the way a person listens when they intend to be useful rather than the way a person listens while they wait to talk. She laid the patent on his desk and told him the situation plain. The debt, Dunmore, the note coming due in June, the home quarter Dunmore intended to take, and the name on the patent. Greer read the patent. He read it the way Fenwick would have read an appraisal, the way Dell read parts labels, the way anyone reads a thing they have spent their life learning to read. He turned it over and looked at the recorder's stamp on the back. He set it down and took off his spectacles and looked at Della and Caleb across the desk. Where has this been? He asked. In a trunk, Della said. 3 years. Since his mother died. She nodded at Caleb. Nobody knew it was there. Or her husband knew once and forgot. And the man's mortgaged the ranch to Dunmore against it. Against what he thought was the ranch. Yes. Amos Greer was quiet a moment, and then he did something that surprised Della. He smiled, a small dry smile. The smile of an old lawyer who has spent 30 years watching the Vernon Dunmores of the territory take what they could, and who has just been handed the rare pleasure of stopping one. Mrs. Ward, he said, and it was the first time anyone had called her that and meant it. Your husband cannot mortgage what he does not own, and a creditor cannot levy on land to satisfy a debt that land is not subject to. This patent grants the home quarter in fee simple to Ruth and Ward. It is recorded. It predates the Dunmore note by years. On Mrs. Ward's death, that land passed by law to her heirs, her children, subject to your husband's rights as the surviving spouse, which I'll need to look into precisely, but in no event does it become available to a creditor of your husband's for a debt he contracted after her death against property he believed was his and a quarter of which never was. He tapped the patent. Dunmore can pursue the bench land. He can pursue the buildings and the stock to the extent your husband owns them. He cannot touch the home quarter. And I'll tell you something else. Once Dunmore knows this patent exists and is recorded, he is going to be very careful, because a man who tries to take land he has been put on notice he has no claim to crosses a line, and Vernon Dunmore knows exactly where that line is. He spent his career walking right up to it. What do we do? Caleb asked. It was the first thing the boy had said in the office, and his voice cracked on it the way a 16-year-old's voice does when the thing he's asking about is the only home he's ever known. Greer looked at him kindly. We make it impossible to ignore, he said. First, I'll have a certified copy of the patent drawn from the county record, so the original can go back in your trunk where it's safe, and we work from copies. Second, I'll write to Mr. Dunmore, on your behalf, setting out the ownership of the home quarter plane, with the recording particulars, so there is no question on God's earth that he has been informed. And third, when the note comes due in June, your father pays what he can against the bench land and the stock, and we negotiate the rest from a position your father has not been in for 3 years. Because Dunmore was counting on taking the home quarter. The spring and the hay ground were the prize. Take those off the table, and the bench land alone is worth a good deal less than Dunmore's note. And a man holding a note worth more than the only collateral he can actually reach is a man who would rather settle than sue. He put his spectacles back on. Your father's not going to lose his home, son. He may lose some grazing land out on the bench, or he may not, depending how the negotiation runs. But the house your mother proved up, the spring, the hay, that's yours and your brother's. Your mother saw to it. 11 years ago. She just didn't get the chance to tell anybody. Caleb did not cry in the lawyer's office. He held it, the way he held everything, and Della was proud of him for it, and sorry for it both. But on the wagon home, 11 miles in the long spring light, with the certified copy folded in his coat the way the original was folded in hers, the boy turned his face away to the brown country running past, and let it go quietly, and Della drove, and looked ahead, and gave him the same privacy she'd given his father, and neither of them ever spoke of it. Vernon Dunmore came to the ranch himself, 3 days after Greer's letter would have reached him. Della saw him coming up the Cottonwood Road in a buggy too fine for the country, a man in a town suit who drove out to look overs the way a man checks property he already considers his, and she knew him for what he was before he'd reached the gate. Elias was in the yard. Caleb came out of the barn. The younger boys gathered on the porch the way they had gathered the day Della arrived, the stair-step of them, watching, and Della came out and stood beside her husband, and they waited for Dunmore the way you wait for whether you have already prepared the house against. Dunmore got down. He was smooth and pleasant, and Della disliked him entirely within the first sentence, which was a compliment about the place that was really an inventory. He had received, he said, a letter from a lawyer, a Mr. Greer. He'd come out to clear up what was surely a misunderstanding, because he held a valid note, signed by Mr. Ward, secured against this ranch, and the note came due in June, and he wanted to be sure everyone understood their position before any unfortunate steps had to be taken. We understand our position, Della said, before Elias could speak, because she had agreed with Elias that she would do the talking, having found over 5 weeks that she could keep her temper around men like this better than her husband could keep his. I expect the question is whether you understand yours. Dunmore looked at her with the particular surprise of a man and used to being answered by a woman in a yard. And you are? Della Ward, his wife. The home quarter you've been planning to take, Mr. Dunmore, the 160 acres with the spring and the hay ground. You've read Mr. Greer's letter, so you already know it. But I'll say it to your face, so there's no doubt you heard it. That land was never my husband's to mortgage. It was patented to Ruth and Ward, free and clear, 11 years ago, recorded with the county. It passed to her sons when she died. My husband's note against this ranch never touched it, and never could. You can see the certified copy if you'd care to. We've got several. The pleasantness did not leave Dunmore's face, but something behind it recalculated, fast, the way a card player's face stays still while the whole game reshuffles behind his eyes. He had known. Greer's letter had told him. But he had ridden out anyway, on the chance that the Wards were the kind of people who could be made to doubt their own paper if a confident man stood in their yard and frowned at them. Because that trick had worked for him before, more times than he could count, on widows and the grieving and the legally innocent. It was not going to work here. Della watched him understand that it was not going to work here. I'd want my own lawyer to review the patent, Dunmore said. You're welcome to, Della said. It's at the county recorder's office, in the public books, where it's been for 11 years. Anyone can review it. Mr. Greer suggests we should all be glad of that, since it means none of this comes down to anyone's word. Just the record. She let that sit. My husband intends to pay what he honestly owes against what he honestly mortgaged. The bench land. The stock he can spare. He's not a man to walk from a debt. But he's done walking from things that were never debts to begin with. You'll deal with Mr. Greer on the rest, and you'll deal fair, because the alternative is a court, and a court is going to ask you why you rode out to a man's house to take land you'd been told in writing you had no claim to. Courts have long memories for that kind of thing. So Mr. Greer tells me. Vernon Dunmore stood in the yard a moment longer. He looked at the house, and at the spring line of green showing along the creek where the hay ground was, the prize he had been circling for 2 years, and Della watched him take it off the table in his mind. Finally, the way you set down a thing you have wanted a long time and have just understood you are not going to get. Then he tipped his hat, with no warmth in it, and said he would be in touch with Mr. Greer, and he got into his too-fine buggy and drove back down the Cottonwood Road, and the 7 of them watched him out of sight, and when he was gone Sam said, into the quiet, "Is he going to take our house?" And Caleb, the oldest, the one who had carried it all, said, "No, he's not. Ma fixed it so he couldn't." And the way he said "Ma," out loud, in the yard, in the daylight, after 3 years of the word being a wound the family had agreed not to touch, was the second thing that day that nearly took Della's legs out from under her. The negotiation ran into June, as Greer had said it would, and it ran the way he had predicted. Elias paid what he could against the bench land. In the end, he gave up 40 acres of the poorest grazing on the far side of the bench to settle the balance. Land the ranch could spare, land that had no water and grew thin grass. And Dunmore took it because the alternative was a court and a record of his conduct. And 40 acres of poor grass was a great deal less than the spring and the hay ground he had spent 2 years intending to take. He settled because a man who has lost the thing he was really after will take what he can get and call it a victory to save his face. And Della let him have his face, because she had learned long ago that the cheapest thing you can give a defeated man is the appearance of not being defeated, and it costs you nothing, and it makes him go away quieter. The home quarter stayed with the Ward boys, free and clear, as their mother had made it. Greer drew the papers to put it right in the law, the inheritance recorded, the boys' ownership confirmed, Elias holding it in trust for them until they came of age, all of it documented in the careful way that meant no Dunmore, ever again, would be able to come up the Cottonwood Road and frown at a grieving family and hope to take what was theirs. Della had a framer in Ledford make a frame, and she put the certified copy of the patent in it, and she hung it in the front room where the boys would see it every day, the eagle and the formal language and the name across it, Ruth and Ward, so that the boys would grow up knowing that their mother had saved their home, that she had done it 11 years before they needed it saved, quietly. The careful work folded away and trusted to matter someday, and that it had mattered, in the end, exactly. When it had to. She did not hang it as a trophy over Dunmore. She hung it for the boys, so that Wesley, who had never known his mother, would know her by the one thing she'd left that could be pointed to and held up to the light, and would understand that the woman in the half-remembered stories had been a woman who looked far ahead and protected what was hers and did not say so, and that he came from that. The supper that united the house had been the one in April, but the house went on being united after, supper by supper, Sunday by Sunday, the way Della had said it would, until the warmth stopped surprising anyone and became simply how the house was. Elias Ward thawed slowly through that spring and summer, the numbness coming off him the way ice comes off a pond, from the edges in, and by haying time, he was a man Della recognized as the one Ruth must have married, present in his own life again, laughing sometimes, rough at it from disuse, but laughing. And he looked at Della across the table some evenings with something in his face that had started as gratitude and was becoming, neither of them in a hurry about it, something warmer than gratitude. She had married him for a roof and the chance to be necessary. She had found, instead, a family and a purpose, and a man who had been frozen and was learning to thaw, and 6 boys who had needed a mother and had been given one by the careful planning of the mother they'd lost, who had reached forward out of a tin box to put the right woman in her own kitchen at the right moment to find the right paper. Della did not believe much in fate, but she believed in the shape of things, and the shape of this thing, the warm supper that earned the key that opened the room that held the patent that saved the home, had a rightness to it that she did not try to argue herself out of. One evening late in that first summer, with the hay in and the boys' abed and the long light doing what it does in that country, lying down gold across the bench land and the creek and the home quarter that no one would ever take, Della sat on the worn porch board beside Elias Ward, and they did not say much, the way people who have come to be easy with each other don't need to. The frame hung in the front room behind them with Ruth's name in it. The spring ran along the creek as it had for 11 years and would for 100 more. Somewhere in the house a board creaked, one of the boys turning over, and the sound was the sound of a house with people in it who belonged there, which is a different sound entirely from the silence Della had walked into in March. "She'd have liked you," Elias said, after a while. He had never spoken of Ruth that easily before. "Ruth, she'd have liked that you finished that shirt, and used her cloth, and opened her room. She didn't hold with things being shut up and mourned. She held with things being used." "I'd have liked her," Della said, and meant it. "A woman who files a homestead patent in her own name and never mentions it for 11 years is my kind of woman. She didn't trust a man to do it, even one she loved. She did it herself and folded it away. I'd have liked her fine." Elias was quiet. Then he said, "I think she left it for whoever could find it. Not for me. I'd never have found it. I'd have shut that room till I died. She left it for whoever came after who'd opened the door." He looked at Della in the gold light. "That was you." "That was me," Della agreed. The light held as long as it could, the way it does on the evenings that deserve a little more of it, and then it went, and the stars came up over the home quarter, and inside the house 6 boys slept under a roof their mother had made certain of, and a man and a woman sat on the porch of a place that was going to go on, which after everything was the only thing either of them had wanted, and had not dared to hope for, and had been given anyway. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.